All right, I'm Rob Moore.
I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
And today we have a guest.
Good guest. Do you want to introduce yourself, guest?
Well, my last name's not Moore.
No. So that he's a bit of an outlier in the field. But...
My name's Brandon False, and I'm an Asian Studies student here at the University of Oregon with these guys.
Right on. Cool. Brandon's also spent a significant amount of time in China. Not, I should point out, Taiwan, like our elitist friend Lee Moore. Real proletariat.
Though I will have to say, today I was doing some introductions in my classes, and my students were each introducing themselves, and one of them was from Taiyuan. And so the other one goes, she's from Taiwan. And they were like, oh, no, wait
not that, no. Don't make that mistake, listeners. That's not a good mistake to make. No. So today we're looking at a very peculiar piece of literature, and we chose it because it's very much avant-garde and experimental. And we don't have a lot of avant-garde and experimental on the podcast. It is a bilingual version of Phoenix Feng Huang by Ouyang Jianghe, translated by Austin Werner.
Ouyang Jianghe, can you place him in a context of Chinese, modern Chinese poetry?
Well, he's still a contemporary. He's still writing, obviously. This came out, I believe, 2 years ago.
He's still alive, right?
Yeah, for sure. He's one of the masters of Sichuan, they call them, along with a handful of other poets. Very much experimentalist. A lot of the newer experimental poets in China are often classified as hermetic, in the sense that they appear to be really just writing for their own personal vision and literally nothing else. And it doesn't even really have to make sense. That's the sort of prototypical way to read it. Placed a little more broadly, from about the 1920s on in China, the great debate really has been over... do you privilege content or form in your poetry? So the early poets in the 20s were starting to do things like, it's a lot more important for poetry to read like poetry, to be somewhat inscrutable, to require things of readers that they might not be used to.
And I should point out that those poets were actually writing stuff that really was inscrutable. Today, I don't think many people like reading poetry from that period.
Depends who you're talking to.
Sure, but it's not something that's commonly read.
We're not talking about Li Bai or Du Fu.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not talking about the biggies.
Which is surprising because you would think the stuff from 1,500 years ago would be way more kind of out of whatever compared with the stuff from 100 years ago.
Right, but when poets start changing things, when the May 4th writers start changing styles and forms, they're wanting to be more sort of self-consciously modern, new. You can't be modern and new if you're using an established poetry style from 600 years ago. So they go, well, we're going to switch things up. We're going to have longer lines. We're going to have quatrains. We're going to chop up the form a little bit, which is fun, but then no one knows how to read it anymore. And so then you have two prongs, right? You have the groups that go, well, no one can read it. Really, it's more important if people can actually follow it. And so there's some poetry that's simply easier to read. Ouyang Jianghe is sort of at the far end of that second prong, where the goal is to push the form and the language itself to sort of its logical limits. So the piece Phoenix is based on the exhibit piece by Xu Bing.
And it's actually multiple poems, right?
Yeah, the whole work is a series of poems. And the sculpture itself is it's actually just a collection of junk. Xu Bing collected stuff from construction sites around Beijing and constructed two huge phoenixes from them.
Which, that sort of, the poem feels like a little bit like a collection of junk from construction sites around.
If you read it in detail a lot, no, it's true, if you read it in detail a lot, you get this impression, and I did anyway, that Ouyang Jianghe starts not with an idea, I'm going to write about the fate of mankind, but with bits. So if you read a lot of them, for example, the poems in this piece, you'll find certain characters repeated 8 or 9 times in one poem, over and over and over again. It's as though he started with the one character, like Chou, and said, how can I construct a poem around Chou? I don't even need an idea. How would I make that work? Very much the way this sculpture works, right? So when you read it, a lot of experimental stuff works this way. You appreciate it differently than you would a sonnet by Shakespeare or one of Li Bai's poems. It is. You have to appreciate it as much for what it's breaking down as what it's building up. And that either grabs you or you go, this is absurd and I don't like it, which both are totally, fine.
Brandon, which camp do you find yourself in? This is cool to see this stuff breaking down, or this is absurd?
That's a good question. This is coming from a guy that just a few minutes before we begun this podcast did not even know that these were separate.
Actually, we had this debate before about whether or not these are, a collection of separate poems or just like different parts of a series too. So,
right.
I think that's a valid concern.
Totally.
Yeah. But go on. Sorry. What did you think?
Would you teach it in a class?
I think I would teach this in a class just because there's so much there that I think students, if they know anything about China, and even if they don't know anything about China, you can pretty much take this anywhere. There's so much symbolism and so many things in it.
So you've lived in China for over 10 years, about 10 years?
No, not quite.
Me 10, Brandon 7.
So let me ask you, how do you think your Chinese students would react to a poem like this?
It's funny that you asked that question because just last night when I was deliriously reading over this...
The best position to read it in, the best mindset is delirious.
I was thinking that this would actually be pretty interesting to teach to Chinese students if there were no censorship requirements by the school. And depending on the level of students, I really think they could get into this.
So, Lee, you've asked Brandon. What about you? What side do you fall on? This is absurd or this is really intriguing, interesting?
I feel like it's absurd. I'm in some ways a literary conservative.
He's a knuckle-dragging traditionalist.
I am. That's okay. But I did find some things interesting. I mean, the fact that the poem, if it has content that's worth paying attention to, I think it is in that sort of, like, he's moving, there's this very sort of romantic notion where he's moving from these kind of trees and groves and things like that, and then we're building up into the city. It kind of reminded me of Baudelaire a little bit. I mean, Baudelaire is not so much talking about the groves and things like that and trees with fruits who have drunk milk, that kind of thing. But Baudelaire is very much about kind of constructing a city.
Artificiality.
And like the construction of a city within a poetic world and how to fit that new sort of urban milieu into his poetry, or how to fit poetry into that milieu. And I feel like that's some of what's going on here.
So let's dive in. What we decided to really do, because there's so many ways you can discuss this,
and it's quite a long poem.
It's
we
very
should
long.
mention it's like 14 pages long.
Yeah,
it's a semi-epic.
I wouldn't
structure.
say epic because that's a loaded term, but
yeah, sure. But I mean, just in the sort of form.
You can read it. I would say you can really read it as a series of movements, one and progressing upwards. Or just individual poems. I think in the same way that you could look at the sculptures of the phoenixes and see the entire phoenix, where you could appreciate, there's a hubcap connected to a series of nails. That's interesting. You can appreciate the parts for what they are individually as well. I read it both ways.
Okay.
But we're going to actually talk about the translation into English by Austin Werner, Woerner. And this is a very, very, very hard thing to translate. I mean, you could argue anything's hard to translate, right? But there are lines in here, and we'll talk about one or two of them in a minute. I honestly don't know how you could have translated them apart from how he translated them. There are other lines which we have some problems with. Yeah. But as Brandon and I were just talking when Lee stepped out of the room a second ago, but which is when most good conversations happen.
Yeah,
Lee's
absolutely.
not here. That it's actually...
I'm going to leave right now.
The podcast is going to increase in both listeners and quality. Now, when we're talking about translation, it's a lot more fun to talk not about, well, clearly he missed this or missed that, But to assume, because Werner is writing this in concert as well with Lydia Liu, and he knows his stuff clearly, but to ask why would he have decided to do this? To assume nothing's a mistake, it's an editorial choice, which is interesting. So we're going to take a look at the first poem, and we should probably read it in English. We could post it on the website too, I suppose. And one of you guys want to read the translation?
Oh, wow.
It better sound good, too.
I'll give it a go. For earth-ridden flight, build a separate sky. Between earth and sky, build a scaffold. Divine and human work are alike. Plant trees in a dry place, and in summer take refuge from the heat. Trees whose fruit have drunk milk, but would sooner pop open a cold soda and taste conceptual sweetness. Aqueous lanterns hang in the dusk. Inside them birds wing, glowworms in their beaks. The forest is gone now. A cement world looms. Flightless, we build homes in the sky, adding brick and tile to the ecology of the birds. Then, from raw thought, we extract letters and flesh, refine steel into litheness. Gold and waste soar. A bird of vast industrial scale unites nations beneath the laws of heart and mind. Man writes phoenix and man's own sign.
One of the things that I want to mention right off the bat is in English and Chinese, there's something striking about the language. It may seem inscrutable and hard to understand, but it does not read like other experimental pieces I have encountered that just seems like pointless meandering. There's something that feels heavy and worth investigating here.
One of the things that when I was reading this poem, it reminded me some of the semi-epic poetry of Haizi, the poet who you're quite familiar with. He's the most famous contemporary Chinese poet, I would say. But in just sort of form and even, I would say, like kind of conceptual breadth of his poetry, there seems to be some sort of connection. How much is Ouyang drawing on?
I haven't read any of that, so I don't really know if he's drawing on Haizi or not.
Okay.
But that tradition, which from which Sichuan, among others, comes, does explore language not in the sense of trying to find new ways to express things, but to actually explore the ability of language to express anything.
Do y'all think language is expressing something here, or is it obfuscating any sort of sense of meaning? That was one thing that I was struck by. Like, there is stuff going on in this poem, but I'm not entirely clear that language, either the English or the Chinese, is doing it justice. And I was wondering if that's sort of the point.
Well, I think the question I would have is the poem... Do you begin any poem intending to express one thing, like you would paint an apple, for example, or is it something broader than that? Are you writing for the experience of the poetic, and that's enough? Or is it only a good poem if you can read it and say, aha, clearly he's writing about a horse ride, or clearly he's writing about poverty in Beijing, or something like that? Is it enough to explore the language itself, or do you actually need a thing to get out of it?
Brandon?
I think it's enough to just explore the language itself. And that's the beauty of this poem. I think when anyone reads this poem, they'll be taking lots of things out of it, and what they get out of it will be completely different from the next guy. So I would go with the first choice.
So, on that note, Brandon, what did you get out of this poem? What sort of meaning or something else did you get out of this?
Well, I should probably preface that by saying I don't read poetry pretty much at all.
Yeah.
And when you guys threw this poem to me the other day, I actually went home and read it. But to be honest, I was reading it more as a language exercise. And there's so much here. Actually, the characters, the language itself is fairly easy. But trying to figure out what exactly it means and pulling meaning out of it is quite difficult.
And I think that's an interesting comment, because much of that is true of Haizi. You mentioned Haizi earlier also. Haizi's poetry, the actual characters on the page, quite often are not hard to parse. They're fairly elemental. What's hard is what he has is his manner of putting them together. You read through it, and it's very, very unclear what we're dealing with. But I think I read this similarly, honestly, to Brandon, is you can try to figure out, quote unquote, what it's about. But really what's exhilarating is seeing these combinations of characters you don't usually see on a page and wondering not just what it's about, but why would you combine these characters?
It's incredibly weird.
It's very weird. Let's jump to a specific line, because I was looking at this a second ago, and it might be a good way to go into talking about translation.
So I was thinking maybe we do one line that we really like, particularly the last few lines of the first poem, and then maybe we'll tackle something that we're less of a fan of. Is that okay?
We can try that. Let's start with a line that I think you can both decide if you agree with this, but I think is an interesting translation, and it's interesting in the Chinese, because I'm not sure why you would put these things together, and that's just about midway. I don't think it's almost exactly midway in the poem.
Okay.
In Chinese, it reads shui de denglong. So shui is water, denglong is lantern, water lantern. And the de there is an adjective, so it's literally something like a watery lantern. That doesn't make any sense. You're literally combining two things that should clash, water and something that gets put out by water. That shouldn't work.
And arguably, fire,
Right, and fire, because that's what a lantern is. It's not an electric light. It's a lantern, Yes. Austin Werner translates it as aqueous or aqueous lanterns. That's a really peculiar word choice in the English, but it's also peculiar in the Chinese. How do you two feel about the Chinese and the translation there?
I think that the word aqueous is particularly weird in English. They're both weird, but I think they're weird for different reasons.
Okay.
And that's one reason that I'm not a huge fan of aqueous, that term. I would just say water lantern. Even though it's not clear what that means, I think that stretching out for this word aqueous seems a bit pretentious.
Okay.
Brandon?
Well, probably. I agree, but I was just looking at it as you said that, and I think it does something because it begins very soft, aqueous, and it ends with the K, the dusk. Right? So it kind of goes from A to Z. I think it sounds better that way.
Huh. Okay, so that's an interesting reading. That's an interesting reading. It's
so you're actually looking at the sort of sonics of the English translation.
Well, because that's what his preface meant.
Sure.
Looking at the sonics. So
okay, cool.
One of the things that intrigues me about the sonic reading in Lee's sort of problem with, like, say, water lantern. Water lantern does not include the de there. The de there, the shui de denglong, implies that it's like water is a property of the lantern somehow.
I guess watery lantern might be
weird, right? I don't know, not weird, but watery just sounds like beer can be watery, or things. It's a negative, very weak sounding word.
But then I guess I would push back against that. And what kind of lantern can be aqueous?
Exactly. So this is where This is where I think I read it closer to what Brandon's reading, because aqueous is not the word that I would choose, but it's a much richer word.
I agree.
Than,
But the word in Chinese is an incredibly simple word. It's one of those basic words that you learn. Whereas aqueous, 9 out of 10 people on the street here in Eugene don't know what aqueous means.
So let's put it this way. Because I threw out there a little while ago the idea that it's good to assume that a translator does something for a very good reason.
Sure.
Why might the translator have chosen a word like aqueous?
Well, I think Brandon's reading of it is probably the best, right? The sort of sonic reading.
And you also have to look, he added the S to lantern, right? And in
It's
Chinese,
true. That's
obviously,
true.
there's no need to make it plural.
Right. It's not clear whether or not it's plural in Chinese. That's a good point. Why do you think he did that?
What's once again to that soft sound, aqueous.
Lanterns.
Okay.
Right.
And that does read, when you read Ouyang Jianghe, a lot of the fun is these sonic combinations. Even in the Chinese, shui de deng long, you have two hard D sounds right next to each other. And it is very different than the soft sounds that translation chooses, but you're still choosing it for arguably a purely sonic reason. And I find that a really interesting translation strategy. If you read his introduction, he's got others that he talks about. But I think it's interesting to shoot more for sound than for lack of a better word, meaning or content. How about some other lines? Do you all have some other lines in mind?
Can we read the last two lines of the Chinese and then the English?
Do you want to read?
Well, before you get to the end, I want to talk about the one about the popping open a cold soda.
Yes.
I felt like he could have done something better with that.
Help me out. What does Bingjang mean?
Cold.
It just means cold.
Yeah.
Because
or ice cold, probably.
And so here's a fun one with that, too. The Chinese, 更想喝冰浆的可乐. 可乐 is literally cola. And if you go to a Chinese restaurant and you order a cola, they're going to bring you a Coke. They're not going to just ask, well, what do you want? Right? Mm-hmm. Soda is sort of a generic term. Mm-hmm. Right? He could have said Coke or cola would be it.
Because I think in Chinese we don't usually they don't usually add "the" when you do. You just say "bing ke le," right? Bing "the." I think he's trying to "bing zhen" to be even with the "ke le."
And I should point out, I read that wrong. Brand's right. It's "bing zhen," not "bing jiang." So sorry.
So "bing zhen," so the zhen for me, I only know it as a character for like Xiao Zhen, like a small town. But here, does it actually, does the zhen add anything to the bing, or is it just a sort of sonic?
I'm really not sure.
That would be a level of, I think, reading that most of us are not up on. So the part of that line that I wanted to talk a little more about is pop open a cold soda. Because pop open is a really, really vernacular reading.
Right.
Especially when we consider it in concert with the word aqueous, which is very not vernacular at all. Why might he have translated this as pop open, or really sort of street level reading?
I was wondering about that too, because for me, pop is this word that Midwesterners inaccurately use to refer to Coca-Cola. So I wasn't sure if, as a Southerner, I obviously hate that word. But I wasn't sure if he was playing his own linguistic games, that he's bringing something into the English that's completely not in the Chinese, that he's using the word pop as a verb in a line that has the word soda, which suggests something really fascinating. It suggests something about what the translator's role is, that he is actually creating his own poem. He's not really translating at all. It's almost like he's doing an interpretive dance of the original Chinese. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Well, I think the emphasis here is on he says a ilaguar, right, which is a can, right? And I think when you look at commercials and advertisements for drinking soft drinks, I think they really focus on that sound. It's not just the feeling of drinking a drink or the visuals of drinking a drink, but there's the audible sound of it, right? Yeah. Uh-huh. So I think it does something there.
Okay.
And you're both right in the sense that the translator here throughout Phoenix does play some of his own word games, some of which depart fairly clearly from the Chinese.
But again, I think Brandon's point,
right.
You're getting back to that sort of sonic element of this translation and of the poem and how that kind of goes back and forth between the English and the Chinese.
In this sense, what's more important is not that a soda has been opened, but the sound the soda makes when it's opened, right? Do y'all want to talk about the last line?
Yeah, is that okay?
The last line for me was, when I was writing about it, this is the one that...
We should mention Rob has published on this poem by the translation.
Word review. It's not really, argument.
I
published on it. Okay, fine. But the last line is really, really interesting because it, in the Chinese, reads 人写下自己方位撇荒位拿. And the English translation is man writes Phoenix in man's own sign.
Which is totally different from what the Chinese actually
Very,
says.
very different. So, what are your feelings about this translation?
For me, we were discussing this, and for me, this is an impossible line to translate out of Chinese. It's not just English; it's any other language that's not Chinese. That's not ideographic,
right?
But in as much as Chinese is ideographic,
right?
Before
controversy,
before all the letters start getting written to us. But because what he's doing is he's taking this word ren.
Mm-hmm.
So ren literally means man or mankind,
human being,
something like that. Man writes itself, the phoenix as, and then he's using the one word pie, which is the first stroke in the word ren,
the Chinese character
ren. And Huang is, so the male phoenix is the first stroke of the Chinese character for person. The female phoenix is the second stroke for the Chinese character for a person, which is a mouthful and doesn't translate very well.
You could translate. Like when you say it's impossible to translate, it's possible. It would just sound awful. If you even attempted to translate all of that, it would just be really terrible.
But rather than doing that, I think the translator made the right choice and went...
He admits begrudgingly.
And went and just totally created his own line, essentially. It's not at all connected with the poem. I mean, it echoes some of the themes of that line, but really this is not a translation. This is just, again, it's an interpretive dance of, in English, of the Chinese original. Brandon?
I have nothing.
Did you like it? When you read it in English, did it strike you? And then when you read it with the Chinese...
I read the preface before I read the poem.
Which is
smart. I was already aware of it. And... yeah, it really comes down to the fact that you can't translate that. It just wouldn't make sense no matter how you do it.
Yeah.
You know?
And I personally think that Werner did a really good job with this line because what he preserved, because the Chinese... I just think that this Chinese line is an absolutely brilliant line because the last 6 characters are presented in almost a classical way, right? Feng hui pie, huang wei na. It just has this
sounds
rhythmic,
like something out of the Sun's Chi.
Yeah, it has this rhythmic punch that's very concise and very striking. And the English does something similar. Man writes phoenix and man's own sign. The rhythm is a very it's a staccato rhythm that really hits when you read it. And like Brandon has mentioned a couple of times, he's preserved this sort of rhythmic punch. And I think the literal meaning, man writes phoenix in man's phoenix, not phoenix, man's phoenix, whatever. Whatever animal we're talking. It's a legendary bird anyway. It doesn't matter what we call it. In man's own sign, it doesn't say in man's own image, which would have been an interesting biblical parallel. Literally the sign, the character, the Chinese character.
Can I ask, can we break it down a little bit? Is he preserving the spirit of that line? Because that line is, man writes itself, the phoenix as one part of man, the female phoenix as another part of man. But man writes phoenix. But you see what I'm saying? There's something going on there that's a little different.
Well, for me, though, the key is the colon, oddly enough, because usually when you have a colon, it presents the logic that supports what you just said, right? If we're going to use the terminology that the translator uses, man writes himself, colon, meaning this is how he writes himself, with the feng is one side and the huang, the male phoenix is one side, the female phoenix is the other, and that forms the sign of man. And I buy that. I buy that. I think it's an interesting way to present it. I don't know that you're going to get, like as an English reader, you're going to read that and go, oh, that must mean Chinese character.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I'm striving for as this traditionalist,
knuckle-dragging traditionalist.
But I think I have to commend the translator grudgingly again on rendering this line that's impossible to render in English and just kind of saying, to heck with it. I'm just going to do my own thing.
Well, I do know that there is a lot of wordplay in Chinese in general and pop culture. I'm not familiar with poetry, so I'm kind of curious if you guys would know whether this has been done before, where they talk about the components of characters and how the translator would have dealt with it.
Yes, it has been done. I don't know if it's been done in this particular word. I wouldn't be surprised if it had been, but it definitely has been done. But I don't know that means that this is not fresh. I think it is still fairly fresh for me.
Yeah, this idea is not fresh. Guo Mo Ro was doing it in the 1920s.
I mean,
really
the Huabin were doing this. We're playing around with this idea, 500 years ago.
What idea?
Like breaking down characters and playing puns with them.
Right. For me, what's interesting, though, about this presentation is it's not breaking down necessarily the sense of the word, but the actual appearance on the page of the word. The way Ren looks on a page is a part of this line. And that sort of conscious desire to present the material form of the language is very characteristic of a lot of these avant-garde poets, especially stuff in the 2000s. There's a lot that I could sort of cite, but this is something maybe not common to all of them, but there's this fascination with how does this look on a page? Like if I write the same character 6 times in a row and that's a line, how does that look? Does that work? Does it break do you stop even thinking about what it means and you're just reading it blindly? Like, what does that mean? And like we said at the outset, that either fascinates you or leaves you cold, as is true for pretty much everything avant-garde.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're coming close to the end here. I was wondering, Brandon, what do you think the takeaway for you is from this poem?
Okay, well, I guess there was really 2 takeaways. I mean, the first is, as Rob was saying, it's aesthetically pleasing. It sounds good. The sonics that he was talking about in the preface. And it just feels good to read it in English and in Chinese. But I couldn't help but kind of place my own political views towards this. And as anyone who knows anything about China, not only the development of the cities recently, but also censorship on the internet and the way that people have to go above and beyond and figure out ways to kind of say things without actually saying them, I get a lot of that feeling in this poetry. And there's a lot of like man versus nature.
Awesome.
So there's this can, the ilaguar of Coke, right? Which is also man-made, with the fruits from the trees. And the trees are there, but how did they get there? They're planted, and they kind of like stand next to the skyscrapers, right? And so I just get this feel for anyone that's been in China for an extended period of time and has seen these banners of progress and development and, build. I think that this comes directly out of that, just this last era of development.
I got a lot of that as well, especially from just the whole concept. I mean, it's based on the sculpture, which is exactly that. It's taking junk from construction sites, which are not just sites where things are made, but they're sites where migrant labor is used and is often not paid or is treated very badly. And this is the cast off from their work that is being used to create something that in Chinese mythology is a glorious creature. It's magnificent.
I like that word you used, cast off, because those migrant laborers are actually themselves cast off from the countryside, or they're cast off from the sort of mainstream urban Chinese society.
And so it's an interesting sculpture, but then it functions that way poetically as well. The entire aesthetic here is, as Werner puts it in the preface, the translator's preface, is things being brought together to form almost chance associations. There are images here that are fascinating, but you're not always sure if they were meant to be fascinating in that way or not. And that inscrutability is one of the things I like about it. I enjoy poetry that the first time I read it is striking and also perplexing. That's my personal aesthetic preference, is stuff that I have to read several times in order to really get either a handle on what's happening or to really appreciate what's happening. And you will have to read this quite a few times in order to really form some of these associations like Brandon was just talking about with the trees and the fruit set next to a cold soda. Why would you do that? And there's lots of, there's that level, but there's also purely like we've talked about many times, the sonic level where the flow of the words themselves is very intriguing. What about you, Lee?
I'm going to be the troglodyte traditionalist and just say I didn't find it aesthetically pleasing, but I enjoyed reading it with the two of y'all just because I felt like I took this poem, which I didn't like, and y'all made me find some things that I liked about it. I particularly like the sort of points that Brandon was making about sort of nature in this romanticist notion that there's actually something going on here in the cast-off notion that you mentioned, Rob, that this is kind of like a bricolage sort of collection of words, which we don't necessarily need to think of as like fitting together all that well, or if they do fit together, they're not meant to fit together in that way, maybe. Even if it is not what I want in aesthetically pleasing objects, it's still like there is an aesthetic pleasingness that forces itself upon my traditionalist views.
And that's the best recommendation you can get if Lee gives it a sort of, maybe not 2 thumbs up, maybe 1 thumb up and 1 kind of to the side.
2 thumbs, 2 half thumbs.
2 half thumbs, which equals 1 thumb, which is a pretty good odds.
Or a pie and a na.
Not a pie and a na, exactly.
All right, on that note, I think we should call it on the pie and the na.
All right. I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore. And this is
Brandon Falls. And thanks for having me here today, guys.
Sure thing. Thanks for coming by. This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.